All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Fanfiction Tapes. I'm your host today, Maya, pronouns she/her, and I'm joined by
Bryon, he, him.
And I am our producer, Ian, also he, him.
Today's episode is a story spotlight on Discworld, and we're going to be talking about some of the most well-known works of Sir Terry Pratchett.
Gotta say, I have been looking forward to this episode.
Yes, this one is one I'm excited to do. I recently discovered the Discworld books about a year ago now, and they quickly became some of my favorite books. And to start things off, what is Discworld actually? It is a fantasy series by the renowned British author Terry Pratchett, set upon a world that is a flat disc that rests upon the back of the giant turtle Atun. I think that's how it's pronounced.
I think that's correct.
It is.
You left out an important detail, which is that the disc rests on the back of the elephants, which stand on the Great Atun.
That's
yes,
correct.
yes,
I forgot about the
yes.
elephants.
Yeah. As Terry Pratchett describes it to us, it was constructed by a god with more imagination than engineering sense.
That's true. If the god had any engineering sense, there would be more triangles. As you can kind of tell from the setup of the world as a flat disc set upon the back of four elephants that ride astride a giant turtle going through the skies, or well, the cosmos, it's pretty humorous. There's a lot of kind of absurd humor in there, but it's also often very politically charged. And that's one of the things that I really love about this series, is that it can make these wonderful political statements and also have a good time.
Right. The whole point of it is to show that it may be a fantasy setting, but it is all situations and dilemmas and complications that are encountered on a frequent basis, that pop up and announce themselves to us, and that's why it's characterized as satire, is because while the details may not be the same as details of things here on Earth, you will often feel an uncanny similarity to things that you encounter here on Earth. But the abstraction of it, the removing the immediacy of it and putting it on another world, allows us to look at it through a new lens and hopefully a little more clearly and a little more humorously, without losing the impact or the relationship that we have to them.
Yeah, that says it probably better than I would have put it. A little bit about Terry Pratchett as well before we start discussing some specific Discworld books. He's an English author. Well, he's known perhaps most for the Discworld books. There's 40-something books in the series. There's a lot of them. And most of the books are fairly self-contained, although there are a couple of short series within Discworld that maintain the same rough cast and themes. He was also a friend of the author Neil Gaiman, who is, if you're paying any attention to pop culture these days, known for Good Omens, which he wrote with Terry Pratchett.
Yeah, so it's funny. My brother-in-law, I was visiting my sister one time, and my brother-in-law had Good Omens on his bookshelf, and I said, "Oh, I love that book." What was funny was we started talking about it, and it turned out that I had come to Good Omens through Terry Pratchett. He had come to Good Omens through Neil Gaiman. We both loved Good Omens, so even though we come from different directions to get there, and once you've read a little bit of both of them, you can kind of see which sections were majority written by one or the other. Basically, if there are footnotes that have footnotes, that's probably Pratchett.
Yes, that's something that he's known for, and he uses it to great effect in the Discworld novels.
He does. In my case, Good Omens was actually my introduction to both Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. I read Good Omens in high school, and from there, that introduced me to Gaiman's Sandman series and Pratchett's Discworld.
And then to round out the trilogy, I had actually come to Good Omens through both Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. I had been recommended Neil Gaiman's American Gods for years as a big fan of urban fantasy, and given some of the recent political situations over the last couple of years, I was recommended to read the Vimes books of Terry Pratchett's Discworld. That was where I started Discworld, was with the Vimes books. And having decided that I liked the both of them, I saw Good Omens, knew there was a show coming out, and decided to pick up the book.
So, what are the Vimes books?
The Vimes books are a short series. There's about 5 or 6 of them, I believe, that follow around a member of the city guard of the city of Ankh-Morpork. Vimes... Oh, I forget his last name.
Vimes is his last name, I believe.
It's Sam Vimes.
That's
yes.
it, yes. I was thinking of the moniker that his ancestor had earned for lopping off the head of the tyrant.
Yep, so Sam Vimes is a cop's cop, which is a hard thing to be in a city where the crime is literally organized and has guilds, is a functioning legal and political entity. But he nevertheless has to go about his business of trying to solve, in particular, any unsanctioned criminal activity that besets his poor city.
Yes, and at the start of the books, Vimes is not a particularly likable character. He's an asshole. He's somewhat racist and prone to getting too deep in his cups. He struggles with his alcoholism throughout the series, although he, I believe, stops drinking during the first book. And the character of Vimes is of someone who genuinely cares about the people in the city of Ankh-Morpork, or, well, he is eventually. And he has a strong sense of responsibility and social power. There is I'm going to jump kind of out of whack a bit in the script. There is one of the things that's kind of breached containment about Discworld is this thing called the Vimes theory of economics. Maybe it's the Vimes boots theory of economics, and it goes something like this. Poor man buys boots for $10 and they last him a year. Eventually, he has to buy another pair when the soles give out. But a rich man spends $50 on a good pair of boots, and his boots last longer than the poor man's. In fact, such that the poor man ends up spending more money on boots than the rich man does.
And still has cold feet at the end of it.
Yes. And this is kind of one of the insights to social inequality that Pratchett works into his books that is really a lovely thing to read. In particular, I was recommended that I read Night Watch, one of the later books in this series, given the political situations in the United States with widespread protests about police brutality.
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things about Vimes and his particular role, and also about Ankh-Morpork in general and the relationship between him and the city. The city is home to what seems like an everyday number of non-human species. The question, of course, is whether they were there all along and only started to emerge when conditions changed, or whether conditions changing drew them in. That's sort of left as an open question. But the interesting thing about that is that city grows more visibly cosmopolitan, especially as the series goes on, and that sort of tracks along with Vimes' relative ascent in and the importance of the city guard over the book's progression. Did you notice that?
I don't think I noticed that on my initial read through.
Right.
Kind of with some retrospect, I can see it now. But I was always a little bit more focused on Vimes' development throughout the series. I accidentally started the series out of order. The first book I read was Night Watch, and then I went to Guards. And for me, I think that was a good introduction to Vimes, because I really would have just utterly despised him if I had just about him as he is in Guards for the first time. But I got to see how he... By the time I had read Guards, I knew, okay, he's going to be a better person. He's just got to do some development.
So I'm going to throw a little bit of a theory here. A little bit of So Vimes is Fukuyama's The Last Man. And here's what I mean by that. So Fukuyama was a writer who, in the aftermath of the end of the Cold, published a text called The End of History. The theory professed by this paper is that there have been competing ideologies throughout history, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the destruction of communism as a threat to liberal democracy as a system, that essentially ended the last serious ideological challenge, which meant that history, for all intents and purposes, was over. What would proceed now from that point on would be refinements or struggles or developments in attempts to optimize or perfect liberal democracy. And so I'm going to propose to you, and we'll see what we think of this, that Vimes is playing the role of the last man in this theory. The theory is that the last man is not the literal last human being. It means the last sort of person who is existing in a liberal democracy. And by liberal democracy, what we need is a democracy that is centered around the rights of the citizen and that is tolerant, right? Not ideologically bound to oppose any of its constituents. So what we see as the series develops is not only that the city grows more cosmopolitan, but more and more of them become members of the Night Watch too. When we are introduced to the Night Watch, it's a handful of humans. As we go on, you get werewolf, vampire, dwarves, trolls, ghouls, on and on and on. And Vimes' ultimate thought process about what he's supposed to be doing, because Ankh-Morpork is not a democracy by any stretch, but both he and his foil, the patricians of Ankh, seem to have a common understanding that the government that governs best governs least. And their goal is to make it so that all the people of Ankh-Morpork can do whatever it is they do to get by on a day-to-day basis. And as long as they're not like actively stabbing each other, then by all means go on. So
long as they're not actively stabbing each other without sanction.
Correct, because there is an Assassin's Guild. So, but that's part of the system as designed, right? And so the optimization of the system to allow those within to pursue their professions and their happiness is the point of the system, and it should not have powers that exceed that. And within that city, you can have all sorts of people that can pursue that Ankh-Morpork dream. What do you think of that? What do you think of that analysis?
That is a really interesting read on it. I think I overall agree with your theory that Vimes kind of fits into that The Last Man and the seeking of governance without governance, if that makes sense. That now I am still reading Discworld novels. I have The Light Fantastic sitting behind me. I've finished The Color of Magic a few days ago. Not a few days ago. Some time ago. And I'm going to have to reread the Vimes books when I get home. Because I think you're absolutely right. But I don't remember enough of that side of the novels. I was always more focused on the development of the characters. In particular, Cherry and Carrot mean a lot to me as a transgender Cuban American woman who doesn't look very Cuban. Carrot, for those who haven't quite read the series, is a human who was raised by dwarves and fully believes himself to just be a rather tall dwarf.
So there's another aspect to this as well, which is that he, and it's spoiler for 30-year-old book here, he is by lineage the true heir to the throne of Ankh-Morpork, which is a touch in like centuries. So in the Apocrypha, it's filed under "Don't ask if you know what's good for you." But the significance of Carrot is as well is that he begins to understand what Vimes means, and he accepts a role as Vimes, his best subordinate by far, a very capable and talented officer, strong, smart, every good adjective that you can think of. But he starts to understand what Vimes is up to in terms of hands off. And there's an exchange at one point where Vimes is talking with someone, and he said he's thinking to himself, Ankh-Morpork had been under the thumb of many rulers before, insane rulers, cruel rulers, evil rulers, but it had never experienced the true horror of a truly good ruler. And he's thinking this in reference to Carrot and Carrot's potential. But Carrot, by realizing this and understanding this, and he stays in his role. He remains captain as Vimes' subordinate, knowing full well that he could easily outmaneuver him or overpower him in any sort of contest the two that could be pitted against each other in. The Carrot would always win, but he doesn't. He refrains. And, the chestnut, the greatest use of power is in the foot, right? So that's a fascinating aspect to Carrot's existence in this milieu.
Ian, any thoughts from you on this?
I am thinking that it has been too long since I have read any of these books.
Oh, they're a treat. They're such a treat. Yeah, so when I was first reading them, I first was searching out the Rincewind books. So Rincewind is the cowardly wizard. Unfortunately, has one of the 8 great spells, or the 7 great spells of the land stuck in its head, which makes it so that he can't learn any other spells because 100% of the neural circuitry is being hogged by the great spell, which results in him being the worst wizard ever. And because
he is.
He knows he's a worst wizard ever, he is a natural-born coward and a functional multilingual.
Sorry, say again, Brian. You kind of cut out for me there.
Oh no, I was just saying that he's survived the whole life to his eternal dismay.
Yeah, Rincewind, when we meet him, is almost kind of something of a con artist, I believe.
With Rincewind,
Like we're having some difficulties. Brad, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, you're coming through much more clearly now. Yeah, wow, you were just all of a sudden much clearer.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I was rambling along, but the only point I was trying to make is that I started with the Rincewind book.
One of the kind of nice things about Discworld is there's really not much of a set order to the books, outside of a couple cases like the Rincewind novels and the Vimes books, where they do kind of happen in loose chronological order. Almost all of them, bar the first two Rincewind books, you really don't need to read them in order.
Yeah, and especially with the fact that there's different parallel stories or parallel genres that the series finds itself in, like the order. The books within the Vimes series have a particular order, but they mean to the particular order of the Rincewind series, for example, and those have no bearing on the progress of the Agatha and the Coven books or the Death, or the ones that follow Death.
Or even some of the others that don't follow particular major characters but are simple one-offs. I believe Equal Rights is one of those.
I think Equal Rights is considered part of the Witches series.
That makes sense.
My personal favorite of the standalone ones is Small Gods. But another good one that's kind of standalone, although there's kind of this... All right, so there's the Rincewind series, there's the City Watch series, there's the Witches series, and there's the Death series. And those are like the four series that have like the major sub-series within the Discworld setting that have a consistent core cast. But there's also this sort of Industrial Revolution series that doesn't have a consistent core cast, but shows up throughout the series. And one of those is Monstrous Regiment, which I know I've recommended to you before.
Yes, that was actually originally what I wanted to do this episode on.
Yeah.
Because it has quite a few trans themes to it, which is why I wanted to talk about it. However, when I moved for the summer, I have not been able to get by a bookstore, pick up a physical copy, and ended up wanting to switch to the Vimes books because I was able to get more folks who were familiar with that, and I had already read them.
Yeah, but there's an interesting consequence of having all these books which are not really related except for the common setting, and even that is kind of loose. So there's a famous comment that Pratchett made when he was asked about a map of Discworld, and he said, "There's no map of Discworld. You can't map a sense of humor." And what is a map anyway? It's just a space beyond which there be dragons. Well, there are dragons, all right, and they're here jostling and trying to sell you souvenirs. So that's typical Pratchett wit at work for you. But the point of that, I think, is that it's sort of challenging to another kind of authorial approach, which is, okay, I must construct the entire world from the stones up before I even start thinking about characters. This is if not quite the opposite approach, then kind of close to it. And it sorts of hits at something that I think is interesting, which is, what is enough world building, right? How much world building is the right amount? And the answer is enough to tell the story, right? More than that, is it necessary or not? That's a question I would pose to you too. What's the right amount of world building?
Ooh, that is a very tricky question.
Thank you.
Personally, I'm of the opinion that the right amount of world building is very fluid and is enough to get the story going. I believe we've talked a little bit about this before with kind of my bare bones approach to writing and only having what is entirely necessary for the story to work and not much else.
Meanwhile, I world build for fun. So right now, that question is hitting me like truck kun.
Yeah, and you know what? Is that approach? There are authors who succeed magnificently with that approach as well, like Tolkien inventing an entirely new language, or because he felt like it was necessary just for himself, or we've got Patrick Rothfuss, who felt the need to create the entire prehistory of his books and create the setting of the decline and fall of the empire as the prehistory that is mentioned only obliquely and by reference and by consequence in the book, rather than a saga that's central to the proceedings itself. So there are people who are able to succeed with a stones up approach, but the question of whether or not that's necessary, well, Pratchett would seem to disagree as to the essentiality of all that world building. Enough to tell the story without boxing you in and limiting your options for future stories seems to be his approach, which is a bit leaner.
It's all very interesting seeing what does and doesn't work for different authors.
So I get the feeling that because he started with The Color of Magic, and in The Color of Magic, that's the first appearance of Ankh-Morpork. And when you get around to the Vimes books, it doesn't look quite the same. It's familiar enough, but it's he was able to take this setting that already existed and flesh it out more so that he could take it in a different direction. And that was a really interesting consequence of having. So it's not that he had it available to him. I've found when I've done ongoing series or stories that exist within the same universe, that if I create a character somewhere else, I then have them on the shelf so that when I need someone to go here and do this, I can say, oh, I can go get that guy. He's available. So, but with Terry Pratchett, it's almost like that for setting. He's got the different places. He doesn't need to know every place between Ankh-Morpork and the Counterweight Continent. But if he knows he has those and a couple other, then he can stitch different routes through them or pull different bits and pieces from them when he needs them. And so they operate like, characters on reserve, also almost like spices on a spice rack, right? You're not every story needs a teaspoon of garam masala, but boy, the recipes that need garam masala really could use.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I remember with the Vimes books, kind of the earlier on ones where the dwarven kingdoms were not super well fleshed out. There was mostly just enough background for Carrot to have come from a dwarven community into the big city. And then as novels progress and as we get Cherry and some of the plots about gender, it gets fleshed out more and we take a trip down there. And it's kind of like you said, it's a spice pulled from reserve. And then I lost my train of thought.
Right. It was available to be a supplement without needing to have been fleshed out before.
I have a question for you, Bryon. Oh.
Darn it, you will just have to assume that whatever I said during the gap was brilliant. No, so in one of the earlier books, a dwarf and a troll are arguing, and the dwarf references a battle that he claims with great victory for dwarves, and the troll argues it from an ambush, and the battle becomes a rather important plot point in one of the later novels, one of my favorites. And the battle is elaborated and even slightly revised to suggest that it was a battle where both armies ambushed each other. But this isn't exactly a contradiction, because all of the history of that battle is murky enough that almost any interpretation fits the facts that are known at the time. So, again, this is another example of there was this thing, this small thing that was embedded in the setting for flavor that happened to lend itself to elaboration when necessary. So I strongly doubt that Pratchett had the idea in mind for Thud when he threw that throwaway reference into the earlier book, but it was available for him when he could make use of it.
Now, I have a question for you, Bryon, about kind of a little bit about world building and storytelling and the general theme of this month, comedy. So, we've talked previously on the show about, you weren't there for this, but about Red versus Blue and media like Elgood is Shive that start off as what we would now today call shitposts. And there's not much of a connecting thread, just various things that the creator or creators find funny.
Mm-hmm.
And both of the cases that I've cited here have done an excellent job of taking what was unserious and world building it into the broader narrative. And that's kind of similar to what you've been saying with kind of how Terry Pratchett keeps stuff in reserves and pulls it on the shelf, although it's done almost from the reverse. It's made, and then they have to figure out how to put it in the shelf. I was curious about what your thoughts on that might be.
Yeah, so I'm about to tell on myself a little bit. I remember a story where I had characters which, in the moment, were unimportant, right? They were there only for the purpose of the actual protagonist bouncing off of them. And so I badly underdescribed them. When I then wrote a story later featuring the same protagonist, I was like, well, crap, now I have to go back and actually think about who these people were. Because I needed those characters again. I hadn't anticipated needing those characters again when I wrote them the first time. But I ended up requiring them for another story, and then I had to basically clean up my own mess. So with Red versus Blue, I'm familiar with that. I watched, I was there when it started, man, he said, putting his thumbs in his suspenders. So the idea of trying to graft some sort of broader, more important narrative, it definitely seems comical to someone who was in the vibes of it in the moment. I believe it happened, but that seems like trying to take something that was one thing and trying to make it something else, right? Sort of like what it reminds me of most is the business, where you've got runs, particular writing teams and editing teams, and eventually they've got some ideas that they're like, oh, I can do this with Batman, and then eventually they either get done or they get tired of it and they move on, and they bring in a new editorial team and writing team, and they or may not have any affinity for what the last team did. So you have the same comic, different runs that have very different tones and ideas and themes, even though the seem the same. So that sort of seems not exactly what happened in Red versus Blue, but kind of similar. That's what it reminds me of most, anyway. But the idea of trying to, it's sort of related to how much world building is enough. Well, there is a limit to there is a lower limit to where if you don't always know it. It's tricky because you think, oh, I'm never going to write another story about this again. In which case, okay, minimum description required is probably okay. But it's more difficult the longer you remain in the same universe, or the longer the same story or set of stories goes, the harder it gets, the more you get wrapped up in your own mythology, and the more you get caught in your own contradictions. That's one of the reasons that the comics love to reboot things so often, is because they can just flush all the baggage and all the complications and all of the constraints put upon them by the previous ownership and start over. It also gives them, the comic companies, the opportunity to produce new number one issues that become collector's items. So there's a business aspect. But yeah, so
you could even say it allows them to flush the luggage away.
To bring it back. Yeah, I like it. Yeah. So how much world building is the right amount? Again, it's the right amount for the story, depending upon how many stories you want to write. You should have an amount of world building proportional to the scale of the task you're setting yourself, I suppose, is one way to put it.
And kind of on a related tangent, something to close out the episode a little bit, some of the, for me, funniest stuff from Pratchett's Discworld novels are in the little details of the world building. One that sticks out to me is the way that they achieve modern-ish technology through magic. In particular, the camera, which is just a box in which a small imp sits and draws a sketch of what it sees. It's a funny, humorous little detail. There's a small, snarky imp inside a camera. And it's also a neat way of introducing a detail from the real world that allows for some nice little contrivances.
Yeah, so there's it's another way to make things more familiar and thus more relatable, right? If it was an entirely alien setting, right, then it might be harder to pick up on similarities in the sorts of things that happen. But tying this back to what we said at the beginning about the satire, is that when you have a world that has cameras and newspapers and that has politicians jockeying for power, and when you can have a political entity that is eerily reminiscent to something that happened in the real world, in terms of the committee to re-elect the president, and its counterpart in Discworld, the committee to unelect the president. That when you have some elements familiar, then that can help the things that are supposed to be familiar land and register as, oh, this is about this, without directly being that. And also, it's funny. It's a funny image to imagine that little imp in there just trying to whiz away. it reminds me of there are a number of thought experiments in physics and theoretical physics that have to do with demons or imps that have precision control of things in order to make the thought experiment work. And this is that in the writing form. This is that utilized for storytelling rather than for the illustration of a theoretical physics point.
Man, I hadn't had to think about any of those demons for a couple of months at least, and now you made me think of them again.
Gotcha.
I'd been enjoying my time without my demons.
Yeah. So, and you sort of reminded me the university, Unseen University, is a recurring bit. The only school of higher learning on the Discworld, and it's described in the Apocrypha as where wizards don't so much use magic as don't use magic, but in an active way, kind of like the atomic bomb. And not only is that a funny thing in and of itself, but it's the end of history again, right? It's the forbearance of the use of power as the noblest use of that power. Even the wizards get into trouble when they use their magic too profligately, and we see some illustrations of that in some of the earlier Rincewind books. And so the wizards who tend to have the longest survival are the ones who find ways to talk their enemies into an early grave rather than the ones who sling spells at them all willy-nilly. So that links back to the earlier analysis I made about the end of history.
Yeah, it's funny. I had heard that term, the end of history, a couple times in passing, but I had never heard the origin of it. So I was kind of struck by that when you were talking about it the first time of, oh, so that's what that phrase is about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, part of the zeitgeist, but that doesn't mean that people know where it came from. Yeah. Kind of like the word zeitgeist.
Before we wrap up, the mention of using magic and fantastical elements of the setting to replicate recognizable technologies actually reminded me of Going Postal, which is one of the later books in the series. It's kind of a standalone, but it's the source of one of the more common references you'll see to the series on the internet, which is if you go on Reddit or Twitter or forums, if those still exist, and people start talking about Discworld, you'll probably see a lot of people typing GNU Terry Pratchett or something like that. And in Going Postal, there's an invention called the clax that is an optical telegraph. And it's developed into this system for transmitting messages long distance, and it has these codes, and the phrase GNU, or the letters GNU, is one of those clax codes that means don't log this message, pass it on, when it reaches the end of the line, send it back. And there's a plot point in the book a minor plot point where a clax operator who has died, the other operators honor his memory by just sending his name back and forth along the clax forever. And Terry Pratchett passed away due to Alzheimer's in
2007, I believe.
2007, I think is right, yeah. And so his fans have been honoring him on the internet ever since with GNU.
2015, I just looked it up.
Oh, 2015, okay.
A few would also surprise. A few years ago.
A few years ago. 2015.
Yeah.
That's actually fairly recent. Jeez. But the other reason I would mention going postal, in the event that the written word is not your cup of tea, I can't imagine why it wouldn't be.
If you're listening to this podcast.
Yeah. Well, but if you prefer to consume your media visually, going postal has a pretty nice BBC miniseries adaptation. Starring, I believe, Charles Dance as Lord Vetinari.
What a wonderful character.
So, yes.
Yeah.
If you would prefer to get your Discworld fix visually, I do recommend that one. Going postal.
Yeah. If we had more time, there could be an entire discourse on the interplay between Vimes and Vetinari and how they're foils for each other, even though their ultimate goal, both their ultimate goal and their ultimate methods align more neatly than either of them would ever admit to. I think that might be a topic for another podcast.
A different time, perhaps, because we are about out of time here.
Yes. Before we go, Ian, do we have anything in the mailbag today?
No new mail today, but a big thanks to everyone who has recently left us 5-star reviews on Spotify. So that really encourages us to keep going. This is a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of work. And seeing your appreciation really makes that worth it. So if you would, like to share anything with us, please send us an email. Our address is fanfictapes@gmail.com. You can also leave a comment on our YouTube channel or a review on Apple Podcasts. Please also leave us more of those ratings on Spotify and the other services that y'all use for listening to this podcast. We are also on Twitter, and Maya, you run our Twitter. Anything there?
Yes. Our Twitter is @fanfictiontapes, capital F, capital T, but only the first of... Actually, I was going to say the first of each, but that's not true because there's a T in fiction, fun fact. I run that. I post sometimes about the episodes that we do and other shenanigans that I feel like talking about. And if you want to reach us there or get anything on the episode, we'll be sure to take a look at anything you send us there as well.
At least for as long as Twitter's still around as a service.
That's true. We are recording these ahead of posting time, and Twitter is just increasingly a bonfire.
All right. Before we go, Bryon, do you have anything that you want to plug?
Well, I mean, I plugged something that I thought was a good supplement to the material last time. I don't really have anything this time, or is this supposed to be where we talk about whatever we're working on ourselves at the moment?
That was the idea, but anything, yeah.
Okay. Well, okay, so my current project is a long fic in the Ruby universe, Schnee Dust Reborn, following a pair of sisters as they try to restart a business that's been mercilessly killed. But this is the Ruby universe, and there is nothing without combat and shenanigans and eldritch entities and whatnot. So I'm having fun with it.
I have been meaning to check that out for the longest time. I'm going to need to strap myself to a chair and read it at some point.
It's turning into my second longest published fic. It's not going to top my longest, like 70,000 words beyond it still, but it's going to be pretty good.
I look forward to whenever I stop procrastinating and actually read it. Well, folks, I am and have been Maya, and I was joined by...
Bryon.
And as always, I am Ian. Until next time, bye.